There were several hands going up, and we may be getting to them. Can we take a few questions together? There's a hand there, and there was one here. Yes, a little bit more. 3. And another one 4. Can we do those together? Would that be okay? Would you like to go first? Thank you.
My question is to do with your experience, your personal experience as a correspondent, and just from having spent 25 years in foreign countries, how does your perception change over that period of time? Like, is it possible even to become a bit more accustomed or desensitized to what you see? And if so, how does that impact how you tell the story?
The perception of what?
Your perception of, what is essentially in front of you, like, as in, it just become a bit more normal to you, like, as in, it's probably a stupid question, but
No, not at all.
the more you kind of experience something, more routine it becomes, more expected.
I understand. Mm-hmm.
So what was done there?
Yeah.
And another question here.
I just wanted to check what your opinion was on WikiLeaks and the Dark Net in terms of
WikiLeaks and?
the Dark Net, sharing information. Do you see it as a good thing or?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello.
Mine is kind of an ethical issue. So we're all quite aware that we've seen a lot of dead bodies and suicide bombings without regard taken for families. The world is getting smaller. There's a lot of people migrating for social reasons and economic reasons. Do we think that we should be taking more care of the bodies we're showing on TV stations?
Taking more care of the?
Of who we're showing, like the bodies we're showing. We have never had really much issue showing that the Afghanis and that compared to, as we were saying, if you have to bomb, you should get American bodies shown.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something we need to do, let's say, as the world gets smaller, people are watching TV right around the world, and they're seeing their loved ones like betrayed?
That's a very good point.
Okay. And there was a 4th hand, I think. Hi.
I wanted to ask about when you were a war correspondent, what's the relationship with civilians in war zones when you were there, and has it changed over time? And also the fact that you as a journalist are getting hopefully at the end of the time you're going to leave the war zone, and does that affect you somehow and also the civilians in the war?
Yeah, let me respond to that first because it makes me think of Graham Greene in The Quiet American. He has a phrase where he says I can't quote it verbatim, but he talks about the comforting feeling of experiencing a dangerous situation with a return air ticket in your back pocket. And it's true, you you can fly into some pretty unpleasant places, but in the end of the day, in 2 weeks or 2 months, whatever, you're out of there and you're going back to a country with good health care and good security and the people you're leaving behind. And the previous question about civilians, they don't get out. They have to live it. That's something that is worth keeping in mind all the time. Journalists get looked after pretty well. I mean, you can go through some tough times, but you can have food and you're going to be able to get medical care. There's always that moment, particularly in poor countries, when you step outside or you're tempted to step outside your role as a journalist and help. And frankly, I've done it myself. There was one guy, I remember a Cambodian man who had his legs blown off by a landmine. And I saw him in a hospital near Kampot in southern Cambodia. And he was lying on the bed, and sitting next to him was this woman breastfeeding a little baby. And it was, of course, his wife and his baby. The problem was, and I got to know Cambodia pretty well, the problem was that this man was a rice farmer, and he had just lost his legs. Cambodia is a very poor country. They don't have a VA there. They don't have, a Veterans Administration giving him a lifetime disability pension and medication and so on and so forth. None of that. This guy was going to go back to his farm, and rice paddies, wet, muddy. You can't farm rice when you have no legs. The prosthetics will just get stuck in the dirt. So this guy was facing, his family was facing obliteration by this tragedy. I'll be honest with you, I gave this guy a bunch of money. Journalistically, you're interfering with the situation. I guess you can make that offer. I don't think anyone would criticize me, but you're kind of stepping outside your role. And those types of situations will happen a lot, and you'll find that a lot of people get sort of motivated to somehow help. And, you'll find journalists who set up trusts or foundations for landmine victims or so, you kind of get pulled into this. The bigger question, relationship with civilians. So normally in a war zone, civilians see journalists as allies, normally, because they are stuck in a conflict most civilians don't want. They wish it would end. They generally find that their government is not helping them. And more often than not, if they discover that you're from Western media, particularly from the US, they'll say, can't the Americans do something? And that's I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. And so you generally get a pretty good reception from civilians, usually warmer than the military, who see you as a potential threat because of what you might reveal about what they're doing. So in that sense, it's not usually a problem in relationship with civilians. I want to go back to some of the other questions. Whether my perception of war has changed, it never becomes normalized, to give you the headline. It's still as horrifying for me today as it was at the beginning to see somebody killed. When a soldier fires for a central body mass, and it's a horrible thing, and it always will be. Not to mention dropping mortars or bomb. You can multiply the effects of trauma. What I have found is that you get better at interpreting what's going on. Gunfire is always scary, but the more time you spend in war zones, the more you learn to know what is really scary and what's less scary. One of the cliches is you distinguish between incoming and outgoing. That's a survival skill, and you need to learn it, because if you don't, you suffer. But no, the headline answer to your question is it never gets normalized. War is horrible. And anyone who's been in war, and soldiers will say the same, that war is horrible, and always was and always will be. And that to me just goes without challenging. WikiLeaks and the Dark Net. I thought WikiLeaks was very interesting. I learned a lot about US statecraft. We have some pretty good writers in the US Foreign Service. I think that the deliberate leaking of security information, of intelligence information by Edward Snowden, I think is reprehensible. What's gone missing in that debate? So the fact that the NSA were gathering metadata on US cell phones has been the dominant headline, and you can argue whether or not that's infringement on privacy. I tend to think they went overboard there, but the amount of information that was released on foreign intelligence operations, I think is reprehensible, and people's lives have been put at risk. I think that's pretty clear. We're now suffering. The Chinese have learned a lot about what types of intelligence were being gathered, and that's come back to haunt us. Snowden's self-defense, that he didn't leak anything, he gave it to journalists and they make up their minds what to leak, I just don't buy that. I'm not a huge fan of Edward Snowden, to be very frank. And what we show on TV, this is a very interesting question. So that Turkish boy, Aylan, 3-year-old boy, who washed up on the shore, and the Turkish policeman was filmed picking him up, was a tremendously moving image. And you could argue galvanized people to talk about this refugee flow in a way that hadn't happened before then. But I wonder, and that's a rhetorical wonder, I am sure that nobody asked his dad sir, do you mind if we show a picture of your dead son on the front page of every newspaper in the world tomorrow morning? I'm sure that question was never posed to his dad. If you did that in the United States, you could be sued. No question about it. You can't film in hospitals in the United States. It's against the law. HIPAA. You will be sued. The idea that somehow underdeveloped countries don't enjoy the same rights to privacy as us sophisticated Westerners, I think is reprehensible, and I think it's a point very well made. This guy, this Turkish man, I think has gone back to Kobani. I'm sure he's seen some of the coverage. That will be with him for the rest of his life. I think he was, at least it would have been nice to have asked him, and I'm sure nobody did. I'm pretty sure of that, because I know the way these things work. There are, you can argue if you shoot a bad guy, you can show his picture, but there are many civilian casualties whose pictures have been used without any feeling by journalists that we should ask permission. And frankly, I think it's reprehensible. So I think that's a point well made. And I think that's covered all those questions. Anything left unanswered?
I think in that case it's going to have to stay unanswered. You've been generous with your time. Thanks for sharing your experience.
My pleasure.
Thanks for sharing your views. Thanks very much, Terry.
Thank you.